Hello, welcome back to another CPaaSAA Talk. This time I have the privilege of sitting here with Ralph Page of Radisys and my good friend Andrew Collinson, our head of research. And we're talking about AI voice, and particularly in the context of telcos, because we saw something really cool happen at MWC Barcelona a couple of months ago, where all of a sudden a big telco announced that they had what's the word I'm looking for? They had transcriptions and translations and all sorts of AI technology inside the core of the network. And I think it was T-Mobile made a big announcement about that. And it sort of triggered something, I think, because all of a sudden this is a thing that telcos are very interested in, and it makes a ton of sense. So, Ralph, how has your life changed since March?
Yeah, so I've been the business development lead for Radisys' AI-enabled voice solutions. So we've been looking at how to get AI into the network for around 4 years. And the announcements at MWC, which were, as you say, from T-Mobile, and we also had one from DT and another from Rakuten, I think woke everybody up to the fact that these big operators are seriously looking at how they can bring capabilities back into voice. So AI has answered some of the questions as to how to add value and actually be able to monetize solutions. So how's my life changed? Honestly, I've been doing this a long time. So I've been in cloud stuff for over 25 years. And I remember many years ago when UCaaS started, everyone was really excited about it because it was an easy business case to get from a PBX to a cloud solution. I'm seeing the same again. We've not been as busy as we are now. Everybody wants to know what's possible. And I think we're all learning what's possible. So yeah, it's been a fascinating last 3 months.
Cool. Andrew, you wrote the AI voice report for CPaaSAA and published that, I think, also around that same time frame in March. So how do you look at this? I don't know if it's a trend or a natural development.
Thanks, Rob. And I mean, yeah, I mean, it was, I've looked at AI voice for a little while, and so it was in the right place at the right time, which is a good thing. I think it's an explosion, Rob, is what I would call it. I mean, it really is an evolutionary explosion point. I think there are 3 fundamental opportunities, and it's not yet clear, if you like, which one is going to be the dominant one. And they've all got really significant legs. So the most obvious opportunity, the first one, is the kind of how do you use AI voice to make an enterprise more efficient? So automating things, booking stuff, or doing more complex interactions. So like the AI voice in place of a person, or doing stuff that people don't want to do. Other ways of looking at it. That's one thing. The second thing is the whole telco AI voice thing, suddenly being able to do AI voice on any call. That's the kind of stuff you were talking about, the announcements, and Ralph's, where Ralph's involved. So where you can call up your AI on your phone, regulation and privacy permitted, and say, help me with this task, whether it's translation, summarization, or actions, or whatever. And the third area is, my goodness, we've just suddenly created, or not even created, we've suddenly made voice into data. So suddenly all of those calls that were otherwise vanishing off into the ether after they'd happened, and if you're lucky in an enterprise, get 2 lines in your CRM, you actually have properly captured by a transcription service and can do something with. And my kind, I'm an analyst, I'm a geek, so I love that bit because it kind of gives me access to more information and data. But I'll be honest, I don't know. I think they all have really significant legs. And the market's at such an early stage, they're all running like crazy. And when I did the research, that's what I was a victim of, was just the explosion of interest and ideas in it. And there's, like Ralph says, there's still a lot of interest, and there will remain a lot of interest, I think, for some time in this, because it's a really fast-growing and changing field. So, yeah, Rob, you asked me, I'd say those 3 things is where I see the opportunities.
Yeah. That resonates, Andrew. I was at the Cavell CX Summit. It's a new summit they put together in London last week for the first time. A couple hundred people with a focus on contact centers in the UK. So let's say the over the top was represented there more. One of my takeaways there was that everybody agrees that the value is changing, right? What the value used to sit in communication. So a great contact center with skill-based routing. I mean, that was like the killer thing a couple of years ago, and then workflow management. Now everybody sees that it's going up. So it needs to be conversations and then intelligence and etc. So that's why we're seeing in that part of the world that CRM companies are building or acquiring contact centers because you need to own the voice, the raw voice, basically, because it's part of your intelligence. Now, what's interesting, what I find interesting here with this, with what Radisys are doing, and there's maybe one or two other companies that are capable of sort of supporting that and enabling that in the world, but not that many, because you sit in the core of the voice network, Ralph. So you sort of sit inside that IMS, which is the magical piece that all these telcos run. And then once you're in there, the beauty is that you don't need an app. You don't have something that you need to install first. If an elderly person calls his doctor, he doesn't need to first install an app on the smartphone. He doesn't know how to do it, right? So there's many of use cases where it's sort of vital that the thing is just works, and there's many other use cases where it's really good if it just works. But it opens up a whole interesting area. So how can telcos monetize this? How do they bring that to market? Can they build it, right, with the likes of yourselves? But also, Andrew, you mentioned the regulatory part. I mean, this we're deep in regulated territory, because we're talking about consumers, we're talking about telcos. It's like the best of all worlds. So how is that going to work? And you have this experience, Ralph. So I'm going to start with you. How is this really working out? You have live customers.
Yeah, I mean, you asked me about 15 very difficult questions there in that short space.
I know. That's sorry. I'm like that. I'm sorry.
So let me try and address it from the start. So what I find interesting to start with is that we as a industry focused on contact center and CX first. And I think there's two real reasons why. One is obviously because we will understand that space. We've all been working in this area for a long time, and we understand the problems associated with that. The other really important point about that, though, is that we can anchor the service at its arrival point into that CX experience. So I know that if I'm running a contact center for a travel agent, for example, I might need to be able to have a translator because my guy doesn't speak Chinese, for example, and we might have a Chinese person calling, and we can do that. But what's far more interesting for me is if we now put that in the network, and we don't know when someone is going to need that, and I'm going on holiday to China, and I really want to go to this famous restaurant. And they don't have a website, they have a phone number, but I can now, with my normal phone, pick up the phone, ring this guy in China, and I can try and book my table using a Chinese translator. So it actually translates for me on the fly in the call. So we are moving, the CX stuff, by the way, and the contact center is super important. I'm not belittling that at all, but we're now moving to a capability where, as you say, we don't need phones, we don't need specific phones, we don't need apps. We can just have services in the network that help us with things like translation, with fraud, with how you can hear, so we can help people who've got hard of hearing, and then we'll see specific in-call AI assistance. And even in that area, I find it really interesting that all the things I just said there are telecoms problems. We understand that people can't always talk because they speak different languages. We understand that fraud is a problem. What I think we're going to see very quickly, and I already started to see it at MWC, is of the verticalization of that to now starting to solve problems that we in telecom don't understand. I'll give you a wild example just because I saw it at MWC. It's possible now for AI, it's in early stages, but it can listen to people talking, and it might be able to spot whether someone has pneumonia rather than a chest infection. So we might be able to help doctors with an assistant. So I think, we're going to see very much telecoms focused solutions this year, but I think as AI gets better, more able to do things, we're going to start seeing people asking us from outside of our industry to help us with those. And I think we've struggled with that for many years, with CPaaS, to understand what is it that people really want versus what we understand, because we're in telecoms, and the AI, which is being developed sometimes for those other areas, can be brought in now and be really interesting. I haven't touched on the regulation, but I suggest we have another question on that, because that's another 15-minute topic. But
okay, I'll come back to the regulation later, but this is a great segue into Andrew's case directory work, right? Because at CPaaSAA, we're very much focused on these outcomes. I love how you say this is really what we should be starting with, right? What are we trying to solve, and who needs it, and what's the business model look like, etc. And then you go into verticalization. And then before you know it, you go into hyper verticalization. It's the world of CPaaS that sort of triggered that. But AI is amplifying that massively. So where does this end up, Andrew?
I don't know where it ends up, but let's just step back one or two places and go. Let's start at the beginning and say it's not easy. AI voice is not straightforward. You have to pull together quite a lot of things to make it work. It does work, and it can work really well, but it depends on what you're trying to do. And at the moment, it's not clear what the winning formula is for that. I think what is clear is the critical decision, which we pointed out in the research, is who owns the runtime. So what does that really mean? Runtime's a bit of a techie term from my language. It really means about who's in control of what bits do what. Other people will call this the governance. I was saying governance, there are legal aspects of this as well. But it's really about how you pull all the bits together is the critical question. So when you look at how an industry then operates, it's what version of that is going to be most successful in different areas and for different applications. And at the moment, it would be crazy to try and call it, because you've got the need areas evolving extremely quickly, because nobody knows what you do with this and what's going to succeed with it, because they haven't done it yet. The regulators always work backwards. So the regulators the regulators will follow practice, and regulatory regimes differ in every country. And you can make generalizations about it, which I can try if you want, but that's going to be different. And the technology models are all different. And we don't yet know. But what you can start to do is start to say, well, who's going to make what kind of decision? What do you think, how do you predict people are going to make what kind of decisions about these things? And of course, there are different groups. Everybody wants to be that kind of spider in the center of the web, the person controlling the orchestration. And it's not really clear who that's going to be. And I think, therefore, what the outcome is likely to be is lots of different models are going to evolve. And over time, hopefully, they'll all persist, because I think that will be good for the market and good for customers. Because I think what you're going to have is something quite conditioned. So you're not going to be able to do certain things in certain markets because the regulations prohibit it, or the technology doesn't work to do it. But you are going to be able to do it in another market. So I think you're going to see a complex new ecosystem evolve and develop in this space. And there's not going to be one ecosystem, it'll be several ecosystems which kind of fight with each other, but also compete in different areas. So it's very hot, it's not a callable space, in my opinion, at this point. But maybe, Ralph, you'll tell me different. I mean, clearly you're fighting for a corner of it, and you're in a good place. So appreciate your view on that.
I think the only thing I would perhaps disagree with is, I think you're right. We don't know what is eventually going to be the top 10 big things, or who's going to own it. But I think what has absolutely changed, which is why it's gone wild since MWC, is people realizing that that if we can bring those elements into a call, so all the clever things that are happening in AI and agentic AI and all that stuff, we do now have the tools to be able to manage the requirements for regulation, how to help people use the services, which is a really important element. So the building blocks are there, I guess, is what I'm saying. Whereas in the past, sometimes, we may have had an idea of how to do something and then thought, but how are we, exactly how are we going to put it together? I certainly think we are at a stage, we have real working solutions. So the translation I mentioned is one, for example, that we've had to deal with a lot of regulation to get that working, and the building blocks are available, and the combination of what we're doing in IMS and the LLMs is super powerful.
Well, I like
Yeah,
what I like
I'd
about.
build on that and say I was talking to John Abrahamson at Deutsche Telekom, and he said this is at Mobile Congress, and he said, and he's the guy who leads the Deutsche Telekom voice button. He said we couldn't have done this 3 months ago, and I think a couple of things that are quite interesting there is not only could they not have done it, but they have done it. So it's intriguing to see telcos like John and his teams moving fast on things. So that's a development and a welcome development. And like Ralph says, it's happening. Things are are happening, and it's moving very fast. So yeah, I think it's an extraordinary area, really, really genuinely dynamic and interesting. And I actually think all the versions of it are going to be successful. Is my take, but they'll be conditioned by the other factors.
So what I like about, let's say, your approach there, and what I'm hearing here, it's becoming a platform, right? And you have the basic functionality. You're inside that IMS, which is really hard and difficult, but you have the special then you have some basic AI capabilities that you use to demonstrate the AI, the translation, the hard of hearing, sound quality improvements that you also talked about last year at CASA 25. So some of those are like I see demonstrators, but I think it's also a pretty open platform, right? This is where startups and scale-ups can plug in, or can potentially plug in, to do whatever wild stuff that we don't know yet makes sense, which is the world of startups, which is the world of scale-ups, which is really exciting. This is where there's tons of AI voice specialists right now all over the world, but a lot of them are in Silicon Valley. Around Silicon Valley, there's a lot of money there, that are building specific solutions around AI voice. Now, if some of those are built on top of this native telco capability, that would be massive.
Yeah, and that was exactly my point about where we are today and where we might be in a year's time, and with the verticalization and all the LLM stuff that's changing. So if I shout a little bit about what we do, so we're essentially doing three things. So our solution is connecting to the IMS network to allow the IMS network, which is obviously where the calls are anchored, to bring in the latest and greatest AI capability. The second thing that we do is we actually connect to those different LLMs and the different AIs, and we use the best one for the particular service we're trying to achieve. So we might use one for translation, we might use a different one if we want to do fraud, we might use a different one, to your point, because they've investigated, they've spent time, and they've developed something for a very specific vertical, and we can then bring that LLM into the native call. The actual capability is the same thing, getting that LLM capability inside that native call, where I've just used a standard dialer, I've got no apps on my phone, I just want to do it. The third anchor that we do then is manage the regulation, because as Andrew said, from a regulatory point of view, it's different in different countries. I've ended up pretty much having to look at it on a per country basis. Even within the EU, sometimes the countries and the regulators behave slightly differently. So our message is kind of, we have the tools to manage those requirements. And I would argue with you on one point, which is where you said we've got some examples of the art of the possible. So these services are services that we have available today. In some cases, you've already heard the announcements, and we're going to bring a few more to market in the next couple of quarters. But these are solutions we have available today, and we've solved some of the issues, all of the issues with the regulatory elements.
Okay. Well, I wanted to go back. So thank you for this. I want to go back to that regulatory part, because I was just in a dinner session last week, also in London, where we talked about how regulatory is part of life, especially if you're in the telco world, and how regulatory and compliance stuff in a world of AI is probably a good thing. I mean, it's complicated. It makes life, it's always complicated when somebody gives you guardrails, but without guardrails in an AI era, I think all hell can break loose. But also for enterprises, it doesn't give them the clarity to actually move into that world of AI if they don't know where the guardrails are, what they're allowed to do and not to do. I mean, in the US, they have a bit of a mentality of sitting in court. Over here in Europe, that doesn't work quite the same way. And I think large enterprises in general like to sort of know what the boundaries are of what they're allowed to do. So regulation and compliance, I think, right now is really changing or from a nuisance into a differentiator and an accelerator. Once we have a bit more clarity what's possible, it allows enterprises, and think of healthcare. I mean, that's a very complicated space to operate in. If you don't have that sort of clarity, nothing's going to move. They don't like that see you in court thing over there. So you mentioned, Andrew, that regulators tend to look back, but I think today we need to work as an industry. We should work maybe more with regulators to build these sort of frameworks together to make sure that they allow for innovation, but they also give enough clarity and boundaries to give us to know where we can move.
Yeah, I think Ralph will be able to tell you more about individual market positions because he's right in the market. I happened to have been talking to a regulator yesterday about a different market actually, but it was quite interesting because what it revealed to me was that there's two things. One is that you have different regulatory stances. So you know, for example, the US is let it happen and see you in court, as you say. In the European model is more kind of before the act regulation. Typically, and therefore people start to wait for regulators to regulate before they do things. And I think the interesting observation there is the wait question, because actually what's going on is not so much what the regulator is doing, it's how we get second guess what the regulator might think or how they might act. Now, in some cases, there is regulation that you have to interpret. But, and very interestingly, the conversation I was having yesterday with the regulator, he said, I think a lot of the time they are too fearful. He was talking about operators. He was saying they're too fearful. They're imagining that we'll do things that we won't do. Now, the regulator I was talking to happens to be from the UK. I won't name them because, you know, I've got agreement to do that in a different context. But they take a principles-based approach. They take an approach that says if it's in the public good and it's not anti-competitive, that's, you know, why would we be bothered? Other regulators have different views and they have different cultures and they have different. So you've got both the regulatory culture and you've got the operator culture, particularly in Ralph's world. And I think one of the messages that we probably need to be working on, and I don't have a silver bullet for this, is but to help operators be a bit less fearful of the regulator and of the opportunities there. Now, obviously, they've got to make sensible decisions, but I think a lot of what we find as regulatory impotence, a good proportion of that, and I'm not going to guess what proportion it is in the minds of people inside the operator, and it's not actually what the regulator is going to do or wants to do. It's fear. And I mean, and white blood cells sometimes resistance. But Ralph, I've said the unpleasant and popular things. You can do the factual, what are you finding in different markets part of it.
But just before I touch on that, so one thing I'd like to add to what you just said, though, is I also think it's a magnificent opportunity for specifically service providers. And the reason for that is it isn't just about meeting the regulator. Obviously, you have to achieve that. There's a big problem as well with trust in the general population. So, you know, as we move to assistants, which are absolutely coming online, we need to make those assistants useful. They need to have some private information. You know, I might want it to know what my travel schedule is. I might want to use it because I'm going to be sitting in the car. I can't look at my notes and I want it to help me with a pricing discussion. Well, to do that, it needs to know some Radisys pricing. I'm not going to be trusting to put that out in, you know, the internet somewhere and who knows where it's gone. But what an operator can offer is our assistant that you are purchasing from us, which works within your phone call, not only meets the regulations, but we commit to keeping a depository or a place where you can safely store your data in a regulated GDPR secure fashion, so that I now am looking at, say, not, you know, the internet, which people are afraid of, but I'm getting a service from my mobile operator that meets all of those regulations, but I can trust to give it private information. And I think that concept, and it leads to questions around things like not just the permissions and stuff as well, but the sovereignty. And you know, we've all been to, I know because I've seen you at a couple of trade events recently, and if you'd said to me probably in January, how often do you hear the word LLM. Oops, I'm just getting.
No,
The
hang on, Ralph. I'm going to cut a minute out because the dogs just went berserk. So you need to pick up where you said we've all been to these trade shows, and because I like where this is going with the sovereignty bit. That's going to be my next step. This is a great talk, right, guys? This is really good. We should do this more often.
Okay, ready?
Yeah, I think we can go again.
Yeah, so we've all been to trade shows, because I know I've seen you at a couple of them, and we're hearing all about sovereignty of the AI and the LLMs, which is super important in that area. And the thing that makes me laugh about that is, if you'd asked me in January how many times you had a question regarding the sovereignty and the location of the LLM, I'd have said a couple of times in the last month. Now, every single day, because people are suddenly. There is a fear, there's absolutely a fear around the regulation, and I totally agree with everything you said there, Andrew. But they're starting to realise, actually, there's potentially an opportunity here that we can take advantage of. So, yeah, I find it quite exciting. But yeah, the regulations are just, we need something that needs to be managed, and so far we're working with different MNOs in their countries.
Well, it's interesting because now, we're now connecting, let's say, the telco voice AI opportunity that we've talked about. You connect it to that adjacency where telcos get into edge inference AI services and more regional cloud or storage and compute services. And that's starting to become a really interesting total picture that can compete for many different use cases with the traditional hyperscaler, put it all in the public cloud and hope for the best approach, which I think is really interesting. Gentlemen, we're running out of time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it was really great, and I look forward to seeing what's next. Quick last question. It's now June. So we're like in the middle of the year. What do you think by the end of the year or by MWC next year, which is February, March, what do you think the big next steps, developments, what's live, what's happening, what's going to surprise us?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
I think those telecom applications that I mentioned at the beginning, you will see as mainstream solutions. So the live in-court translation, AI assistance, the ability to help with fraud, transcription, notes and summaries will start to come online. We're already seeing the press releases, as we mentioned earlier. What will surprise us? I suspect that what will happen is there will be a number of guys who are currently developing AI solutions, maybe not even for telecoms, but specifically for medical or for concierge or for shopping. And we will look at that and go, wow, that works beautifully inside a call. So do I know what they are right now? No. Am I excited as to what we're going to be able to do? Absolutely. And the other thing I think as well is that the next focus isn't actually the regulator. That's understood that's something we have to solve. But I think it's teaching people to use these capabilities. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to pick on you, Rob, because you said something to me earlier when we were chatting that reminded me. We were talking about what do I do with all my transcriptions, and you said, "Oh, I give it to ChatGPT, and it sorts everything out for me, and it reminds me months down the line." Brilliant. Take my brother, who's a very clever lawyer, and you say to him, "Oh yeah, you just need to take your transcriptions and put it in ChatGPT." He'll look at you and go, "In what?" And that's the next stage of excitement. When people start to learn how to use these things, and we get better at teaching them how to take advantage, I think it's going to be really interesting next year.
Cool. Andrew, same question for you. 6 or 9 months down the road, around the year end?
Asked me in November, because then I will have started the research, the second stage of research for CPaaSAA. We'll obviously be featuring this in a big strand at CPaaSAA 26 in September in Amsterdam. So I'll be using that as a research, and also to convey what we found, but also to find out other things from other people. but I'm going to do the second round of that research starting basically after CPaaSAA. So I shall be doing the rounds, talking to everyone again, at this time a little bit more prepared for the amount of conversations I need to have and the complexity of the topic to come. So I think Ralph's right. I think we're going to see a lot of stuff happening. I don't want to second guess it. I'll tell you when a bit later down the track.
Okay, fair enough. Analyst. Ralph, I look forward to seeing you at CPaaSAA because Radisys are sponsoring that. Thank you very much. It'll be fun. That's only 3 months away, so we'll probably have some great updates there. Thanks so much, both of you, for this conversation, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Rob.